There's another logical fallacy in musculoskeletal rehabilitation, and it's this circular reasoning problem. And it's best illustrated when people are utilizing like injury or movement screening processes. And these systems can feel incredibly scientific to the clinician and to the patient. There's going to be some movements, they might score them, there's going to be like some sort of thresholds. You're going to pass or fail or get some sort of score at the end. And then there's probably going to be some sort of conclusion about your current injury or some conclusion about the potential for an injury. And these systems end up becoming self-validating. They're all based on this same premise that people get injured because they have poor movement quality. That's the premise they're all based on. So the screen is then developed to identify this poor movement quality. And then somebody gets injured. And then they get screened. And then they perform poorly. And then the clinician says something along the lines of, see, your poor movement caused your injury. And everyone needs to just kind of stop right there, because the only thing demonstrated is that an injured person performed poorly on the screen. You did not demonstrate that their movement caused the injury. You've simply confirmed that the person met the criteria you already decided was important. And that is circular reasoning in action. But the circular reasoning around these can get even worse when people use these as tools to try to predict a future injury. And you'll see this at like strip malls or local 5Ks or other kind of sport events where there's like a physical therapy booth or a chiropractor booth there, and they're doing free movement assessments or free injury screens, and in the end it's a way to try to convince you to come to their clinic because of how you did on their screen, the things that they saw. So you take this relatively healthy person through your screening process, and then you tell them, man, you're at increased risk of injury based on my screen. And then let's say later that person gets hurt, the clinician can turn around and say, look, I predicted it with my screen. But they're never talking about all the people who did poorly on their screen but then never got injured. And they're not talking about the people that did really well on their screening process but then did get injured. And if the screen can't meaningfully distinguish between those two groups of people, then what is it predicting? And the quick concession I'll make on this is that movement screens aren't completely useless. They can give a clinician an organized, structured way to take a patient through some movements that they might want more information about. And so the screen in that way can give you some information that might help you decide what might be worth investigating right now and help you start to form some hypotheses around what you want to do. But that's really where its utility ends. And the screen can help you generate that hypothesis, but it can't confirm your hypothesis, so you can't confuse those things. So like if I'm watching somebody squat, maybe I see something during their squat based on their history and their injury and why they're talking to me. Maybe there's something I want to investigate a little further. And so okay, that's fine. So I can turn around and change maybe the loading or the task a little bit, change how they're moving, do a little coaching, and see what happens next. And that's called sound clinical reasoning. But I can't say, man, you failed my screen, therefore I have found the reason that you're injured, or I am seeing something that will cause you injury in the future. That's not reasoning, that's using a test to confirm its own premise. And this is important because these conclusions you draw from these screens don't just stay in the clinic. That person, it's going to follow that person out into their real life, out into their training. They're going to be thinking about, man, my movement is dysfunctional according to that guy. Or, geez, he told me I'm at an increased risk for injury if I'm not careful. And holy cow, he gave me all these things I need to fix before I can safely train in the future. And so this person becomes somebody who's just monitoring everything that they do. They're afraid to move, the quote, wrong way. They're going to start avoiding different positions, and they're going to just be hyper vigilant about everything that's going on with how they're doing anything. And then the screening tool that was supposed to help them just becomes a source of unnecessary stress and restriction in their life. And the problem with treating these screens as some sort of form of universal truth is that human movement is not standardized. We have different body types. We're asking people to do different tasks at different times. There's different loading variables. People have different levels of experience with a task, different levels of exposure. Fatigue plays a role. A time when a movement is completely appropriate in one context might not be as appropriate when they're performing it in a different context. So if somebody performs poorly on a standardized screen, what did you actually learn? You learned that they're not particularly good at that screen. That's really all you've learned. But that is information, but it's not automatically some sort of pathology that the person has. And it is not proof that there's an injury in their future. So you have to be careful there. So these are the questions I want you to start asking as a clinician. What did this screen actually tell me that I didn't already know? And then the next question, what hypothesis does this give me to start testing? And those are more useful questions that you can gather from some sort of movement screening. Because good clinical tools are there to help you ask better questions. They don't give you an answer simply because somebody failed this test. And the more rigid that a screening system becomes, the more important it is to ask whether you can ever be wrong. Can the screen tell you this person performed poorly, but they're doing just fine? Does the screen tell you that? Does the screen tell you this person passed, but they still have some sort of problem? And are you allowed to change your mind on anything if you use this screen? If the answer to those things is no, then you're not using a system for clinical reasoning. You have entered yourself into a belief system. So remember, movement screens can be a useful tool. You can use them to gather information as a clinician. You can use them to start to form a hypothesis. You can use them to decide what might need to be investigated further. But the screening cannot become both the question and the answer, because the movement you test proves the conclusion that you built into the test. And now you're not screening, you are just using circular reasoning. And the patient is the one who gets trapped in the circle.